In recent political history, the United States has been engulfed by the politics of opposition. Rather than campaigning on their own merits and policies, each party has begun to point out the opposition's flaws and use those as the mainstay for their campaign. This episode's guest, the former political director at the Republican National Committee, Gentry Collins, explains that the 2018 midterms were no different. In our discussion, we delve into how the United States can move past the politics of opposition and into a more substantive politics. We cover the messages and strategies that Democrats and Republicans will need to bring into 2020 to ensure their success and a bright future for the country. With that, I'd like to spend a minute to thank some of our Patreons to the podcast. Thank you to Mike, Julie, and Tiana for becoming $15 per month Patreons. And thank you to Scott and Michelle for their tremendous $10 per month support. It is all greatly appreciated. So if you'd like to support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/billswithluke to become a Patreon of this podcast today. Your support is greatly appreciated, and I cannot wait to see you with a Bills with Luke Scorzell sticker on your laptop, your phone, or whatever else you decide to put it on. With that, stay tuned for a direct, uncensored interview. I'm Luke Scorzell, and you are listening to Bills. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Bills with Luke Scorzell. Today we have Gentry Collins here to help us break down the midterm elections and discuss the future of the Republican Party. Gentry has extensive political experience, including as the former national political director at the Republican National Committee and as current partner at Collins Anderson Phillip Public Affairs. He has also worked on several presidential campaigns, including the 2004 Bush-Cheney re-election bid. And most recently, he was a fellow at the University of Southern California's Center for the Political Future. And today he joins us on the show. Thank you so much for coming on, Gentry.
Luke, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation. I think it's going to be very interesting, especially after what just happened in the midterms. But reflecting on that before we kind of go into the future, what are your thoughts on the midterms? I mean, they weren't bright for Republicans. They lost close to 40 seats in the House and hundreds of seats in state legislatures across the country. If listeners want more details, they can go to the last interview with Luis Alvarado. But did Republicans do something wrong in 2018, or were Democrats just on fire? Was it just a Trump phenomenon?
Yeah, I think the 2018 midterms are fascinating for a variety of reasons. But as good a night as the Democrats had, I don't believe that it was as positive a night for Democrats as has been made out. And I, by the way, want to be clear at the outset. I don't say that by way of taking anything away from the Democratic Party or Democrats who ran good campaigns around the country or were able to take advantage of the political environment that sort of swept them into power, at least in the House. But rather to say that both parties, I think, have made the same mistake over the last, let's say, dozen years or so of American political history, which is that we've won elections not by winning a mandate of our own, but by forcing the other party to lose or taking advantage of the weakness in the other party from time to time. And so if you think about going all the way back to 2006, Democrats were able to win the House in 2006 largely on an anti-Bush sentiment, not because they laid out some positive agenda for the country. Then they won the White House in 2008. Republicans came back and won the House back in 2010. But just like the Democrats had in 2006, the 2010 campaign was really about opposing Obamacare. I was political director at the RNC during that cycle. The whole campaign was run on two words, and those two words were fire Pelosi, right? Successful politically. We won a lot of seats here, half again as many as the Democrats won this year. But I think in hindsight, it needs to be said that we won those elections by opposing Democrats, not by saying to the country, here's how we get you to a better place. That pattern continued in 2014 and 2016 and in 2018 with Democrats taking the House back largely by opposing what Republicans in Washington have been doing. And so I think that the 2018 midterm was a status quo midterm, and I know that's a controversial claim. So let me explain what I mean by that. It's status quo in the sense that it continues that pattern. I don't think that Democrats won, Republicans lost, and I think that fits a recurring, repeating pattern for both parties that now extends something more than a decade. And so as good a night as Democrats had, I don't think that they did anything in this campaign that sets them up to break that pattern going forward. And I think that's deeply unfortunate, by the way, for both parties and more importantly for the country that is clearly looking for something in its politics, in our politics, that we're not getting from the two major parties right now. So that's sort of my read of the midterm election, status quo in the sense that it continued a decade-long pattern. I think what the future holds is more of the same until we break that pattern of simply opposing the other party.
So essentially heading into 2020, do you think it's going to be just another election where Republicans are opposing the Democratic agenda and Democrats are opposing the Republican agenda, or it's going to be, I mean, how do we move past this phenomenon where it's just the politics of opposition as opposed to the politics of here's what we have to offer you, and that's why you should vote for us?
Sure. Well, so let me offer a couple of thoughts. One, the politics of opposition were better in midterm elections than in presidential elections. Right? Presidential elections, executive elections tend to be more about the future of the country, the direction that we want it to take, whereas midterms historically have been more about opposing the president that we currently have. And certainly modern midterm history follows that pattern, I think without exception. If you thought about it hard enough, you might find an exception, maybe 2002, though I think that exception would have been because of the sort of the historical anomaly going on at the time, which is that the country was still really. But other than that, I don't think there are any exceptions in modern history. Presidential elections are somewhat different, and particularly presidential elections where an incumbent is on the ballot. We have had in the last several presidentials, we've had a couple where the incumbent was not on the ballot. You think about 2008. You think about 2016. 2020, of course, will not be that way. President Trump very likely will be on the ballot. Of course, he's already preparing his reelection campaign. So I think the onus will be on President Trump to say, here is how my presidency to date has lifted the country to a better place. I think that the Democrats really run the risk of being the party this cycle, and I don't, by the way, this is not a partisan statement. I think this is a pattern that both parties have followed. But just based on incumbency, the Democrats really, I think, are the party that most at risk of being the party of opposition in an election cycle, and a presidential election cycle, where the country has a chance to pick a better agenda, to pick a more constructive vision. And that's one of the real problems, I think, for a party out of the White House. It's one of the reasons that more presidents have been reelected than not reelected. You think back to 2012, for example, where the polling was very clear that the country was ready to consider an alternative to President Obama, and yet the Romney campaign was largely about the defects in the Obama presidency. We got to Election Day, and his approval rating, favorability rating were both at historic lows for a president who was reelected. What did the Romney campaign not do? It did not paint a better vision for how a Romney presidency would advance the interests of the country. And I think Democrats now are very much sort of in that position. Their base will demand vigorous opposition to President Trump. For some good reason in some areas. Yet, I don't think opposition to any president, President Trump included, is sufficient. I think at a presidential election, there is a demand and an opportunity for something other than opposition. And so the Democrats are going to have to figure out how to balance those things. I don't think either party has balanced those things very effectively in modern history. President Clinton in 1992 may be an exception to that. But with an incumbent on the ballot and running against an incumbent, that historically has proven to be a pretty tall task.
For the most part, with Trump, it's already baked into the cake. As far as whether people agree or disagree with his agenda, I don't really think Democrats are going to have too much room to gain more people who like totally hate Trump versus Trump getting people to more agree with him. So what is the message that you think Democrats will bring into the 2020 elections if they're not just going to run on the we strictly oppose Trump? Because I think that's already like set where you have this amount of the country that's going to hate Trump no matter what he does, and you have this amount of the country that will agree with him no matter what, and then you kind of have this middle ground, and there, I guess, what's up for grabs. So what strategies do you think Democrats will bring in?
Yeah, I don't know what strategy they will bring in, and I not to give you a bad answer here, but I don't think anybody really knows. I think one of the great questions for 2019, which is where the bulk of the Democratic primary conversation will happen, right? I mean, we think of 2020 as being the presidential year, but candidates are already coming here to Iowa. They're already coming to New Hampshire. They're already considering other geographic nominating strategies. California, for example, being perhaps more relevant this time than it has in recent nominating history for either party. And I think that question that you've asked is exactly the debate going on in some ways inside the Democratic Party now. How do you offer something that is not simply in opposition to Trump, and where that something fall on the ideological spectrum? I fundamentally believe that the country is still a centrist and maybe even center-right country. We don't think Washington can run our lives better than we can run our lives ourselves. And so I think that there are a couple of risks for the Democratic Party. One is simply being an anti-Trump party, full stop. I think that is a real risk for the Democratic Party. My party has made that mistake, and it has cost us the White House in previous cycles like this. So I think the Democrats certainly will have a temptation towards that. And by the way, that temptation is sort of encouraged in either party's nominating contest, because you're talking almost exclusively, when you're talking to a nominating base, almost exclusively you're talking to people who agree with your point of view about Trump, whether that's positive in the Republican case, negative in the Democratic case. And so the experience of running that campaign, I think, will reinforce for candidates and campaign staff, campaign operatives, and so forth, this idea that opposition, vociferous, aggressive opposition to Trump, who can out oppose Trump, right? Who's going to be more pure in their opposition to this president? I think will be a real and serious temptation for candidates trying to set themselves apart in a very crowded presidential nominating field. So then comes the question: if the Democratic Party wants to offer something more constructive, then there's a whole other conversation, I think, going on within the Democratic Party about what that might look like. My own view is that to the extent the Democratic Party's answer is about division, is about tribalism, is about saying we're going to divide the country by race, by age, by gender, by orientation, by whatever other set of divides we recognize in our politics today, my own view is that is not a sustainable winning strategy. I don't think, for all of the demographic problems that Republicans have had, the gender gap, which is reopened in this last cycle, millennial gap, a gap with other minorities, Hispanics, probably most notably in many parts of the country. I would say that what is less talked about, but equally impactful at the presidential level, is that Democrats have a geographic problem. There are fewer and fewer states where the Democratic Party and a Democratic nominee for president are really competitive. And I don't think that that pulling farther to the left, ideologically, or running a campaign that's about tribalism, which I think is a real temptation inside the Democratic Party today, is effective in those places where geographically they have become marginalized. You think about the industrial Midwest and even the agricultural Midwest, for example, as being places where the Democratic Party is far less competitive. I will forget here the precise numbers, but if you look at the number of counties in the country where Bill Clinton was competitive in 1992 or 1996, compared to the number of counties in which Hillary Clinton was competitive in 2016, the decline was something on the order of half, right? In other words, Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign contested approximately half the number of counties around the country that Bill Clinton's presidential campaign did. And of course, a variety of reasons for that. But nevertheless, in order for the Democratic Party, I think, to re-expand its geographic base, it's going to have to offer something other than the only reason you might oppose illegal immigration is because you're racist, sexist, xenophobe, right? I don't think that narrative re-earns them any middle American swing votes. I think they've got to say something that's more compelling to the middle of the country. Whether they do that or I think is largely what their primary will be about.
And I'd like to get into that a little later, the whole identity politics thing and how Republicans can move forward past that. But first, I think a lot of the messaging that's going to go into 2020 is going to be a result of what happens in 2019 when Democrats take the House on January 3rd and what their agenda is. I mean, right now you have the Russia investigation is kind of, I guess, heating up on Trump, and that's a very divisive issue. But you also have what's just happened with healthcare. The Texas court judge ruled that Obamacare or parts of it or the entire thing were unconstitutional because the individual mandate was taken away. So they have a lot of options, I guess, is what I'm saying, going into the new year. Do you think they're going to take this divisive tribalist route where they pursue possible impeachment against Trump, where they're calling for it constantly and encouraging more of the Russia investigation? Or are they going to try to come together with Republicans and really become this uniting party in what has become a very divided politics?
I think they have the first opportunity to break the cycle of merely opposing the other party. At President Clinton and Speaker Gingrich after the 1994 elections, so from 95 through 96 in the run-up to President Clinton's reelection, after Republicans won the House majority in 1994, I think for the first time, Luke, in something like 40 years. We go back and check that number, but it was something like that. It was a much more substantial historical shift than the one that just happened. I think Clinton lost something like 52 seats in the House that year, 7 or 8 seats in the Senate. And Republicans that year had run on something more than simply opposition to Clinton. You may recall that as the contract with America. I believe there were 10 points in the contract with America that Republicans ran on. And over the course of the next year or two, they pursued that agenda, a policy agenda. Now, you can agree with that policy, disagree with that policy. It's all, of course, debatable. That's what politics is about. But it was not simply focused on opposition to Clinton as a human being, or even as a partisan adversary. And President Clinton, very much to his credit, signed something like 8 of those 10 points in the contract with America into law. President Clinton also worked with Speaker to balance the budget. He worked with the Congress and within his own administration to radically reduce the number of federal regulations on the books. And so what happened is he went from losing much worse than the Democrats did this time around to winning re-election with relative ease a couple of years later. But he was reelected on a set of policy achievements that were frankly enabled by a Republican majority in Congress. Now, at the same time, I would say that Speaker Gingrich's majority in Congress turned out to be much more durable than more recent majorities. Right? That majority was not unseated until the Democratic wave in 2006, and so that lasted for a dozen years, and until Republicans were drawn into an impeachment conversation, which did not end well for them, by the way. It's just as a sidebar, Luke, I would say that one of the very few cycles in American presidential history, midterm history, where the party of the president picked up seats in the midterm was 1998. And what was going on in 1998 is that Republicans had moved away from being a party of ideas. We had moved away from being a party that was looking to say, here's how we get the country to a better place. We were no longer the Contract with America party, working with President Clinton to get those signed into law and balance the budget and so forth. By 1998, we had been consumed with the Monica Lewinsky investigations and Ken Starr's activities and so forth, and impeachment of the president. And there was a real political price to pay for that in 1998 for Republicans. So, I think there is recent historical precedent to say that the that the newly in power party in Congress can look towards saying we can do something with the ideas that we ran on. We can get a president of the other party to sign some of those ideas into law where we can find common ground, maybe not all of them, but some of them. The country may do well. Our majority will likely do well, but history would suggest that that is also good for the president himself. And so will the Democrats be willing to make that bargain? I think it would be good long-term for their party if they did. It may not be good short-term for their party if they did. And so I think there's a real sort of Faustian bargain to be made. Which bargain Speaker Pelosi will make, I think, will be one of the really fascinating things to watch unfold in 2019, along with the Democratic primary for president.
Well, and it definitely is interesting because you kind of have these two wings of the Democratic Party. So you have like the establishment and Nancy Pelosi, who I believe was saying that the newer Democrats, which is the other kind of wing, and they're kind of this new progressive wing that was more calling for impeachment versus Nancy Pelosi, and kind of the establishment was saying, well, wait, that might not be the best thing to do right away, and kind of just let the investigation play out and see where things lie coming up into 2020. But you have a lot of items, I think, that both President Trump and the Democrats could work together on. They've both called for new infrastructure, new ethics in Washington in terms of getting lobbyists out. So, I mean, there are ways that they'll be able to work together.
Right.
So,
and frankly, after you mentioned it in your question, dealing with the sort of newly reopened questions about the constitutionality of Obamacare and what happens after that. You know, President Trump's instinct, I think, will be to take a victory lap and to say, look, we're going to get rid of Obamacare, and it didn't happen the way we wanted it to happen, but we got rid of Obamacare. Fine. That said, that does nothing to reduce the cost of health care for individuals and families in the country 2 years before he stands for re-election. He's going to have to do something about the cost of health care. Democrats are going to have to do something about the cost of health care. And I think in a Washington where it's not an argument over repealing Obamacare, if it were in fact the case that the Supreme Court got rid of Obamacare, I think there are real political motivations, and I mean that, by the way, in the positive sense, both parties to come to the table and work something out on that. What are the details of that, and would that even happen? I don't know, but I would, as a political advisor to either party, I would advise that we do something more like that than focus on impeachment. I mean, look, these investigations are going to find what they find once the facts are known, and they're known in a nonpartisan or bipartisan way. Then you deal with those facts. I would caution my Democratic friends that one of the great mistakes that modern conservatives made was tying too closely or conflating the term conservative with how aggressively are you going to oppose President Clinton during his second term? How aggressively are you going to oppose President Obama? That was a desperate mistake to pin a set of ideas that are so robust, that are so rich, that are so powerful, that are so historically significant and hold so much promise for the future of the country. To limit those ideas simply to opposing the other, I think, as tempting as it is in political time, it turned out to be a desperate mistake. I am not rooting for liberals in this country. They're a disaster for the country. They always have been. And I think you look at liberal experiments around the world, and without exception, they're a disaster. So I'm not rooting for them in that sense. But I would say, simply in terms of political strategy, that as tempting as shots at this president may be, and as justified as some of them may be, that if you're limiting the ideology, that if what you've said, Luke, is true, and I believe it's true, by the way, that sort of the new members of Congress, the more progressive members of Congress, more liberal members of Congress, if you want to use more honest language, really are defined by opposing Trump. That's a mistake for their ideology. If their ideas, if they really believe that their set of ideas elevates the country in a meaningful, constructive, durable way, inclusive way, then they ought to be focused first on those ideas and then on dealing with political adversaries. Republicans, conservatives, myself included, have gotten that wrong over the years, and the consequences of that have been dire and durable. And so I think if they can learn that lesson and shift to a politics that is about ascendancy rather than about opposition, then they may have something for a while in American politics. If they are only about opposition, they may win some short-term battles, but they will do so at a cost of the legitimacy of their ideological ideas or positions. And I would suggest that that's probably not a good trade.
And ultimately, this brings us to the second party in the equation, which are Republicans. So we've talked a lot about Democrats and how they probably ought not to be the party of opposition going into 2020 if they want to be successful. But what about Republicans? I mean, you say it wasn't as bad of a year as it looks, which I guess relative to years past, it wasn't quite as bad.
Right.
But it wasn't great for Republicans still. I mean, the economy was still doing very strong.
No, it was a very bad. It was, and just let me be clear about that. I know in saying what I've said that it wasn't as bad as it looks. That in many respects can appear to be sort of excusing what happened. There is no excuse for what happened. It was a terrible year for Republicans, and frankly, it was as bad as it was in large part because we only have been a party of opposition ourselves. I mean, look, we ran from 2010 through 2016 on repeal and replace Obamacare. We get a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, a Republican president, and we're appointing people to the Supreme Court. And guess what? We weren't able to repeal and replace Obamacare. And not only that, the American Republican alternative they could consider to replace Obamacare. So I don't mean to put on my partisan jersey and say, oh, it's really okay for the Republican Party. It's not okay for the Republican Party. My admonishment is really more for my friends in the Democratic Party. Don't make the same mistake we did. Don't look at an election where you simply were better than us. You're merely better than the alternative, which alternative, by the way, sucked, okay, to be candid. And all of a sudden determine that now, that's all I need to do in order to be an ascendant, durable majority party in the United States. That is flatly false. It is a total misreading of results. And that's really the point I'm trying to make in suggesting that this was not some realigning wave as been suggested by a lot of pundits. I went back and looked at all of the modern midterm elections. So since World War II, 1942 to present day, there have been 20 midterms in American history. The net seat gain for Democrats was 7th out of those 20. And so I'm not suggesting it was a good night for Republicans or it wasn't a good night for Democrats. What I am suggesting is that the results ought not be viewed through the lens of NBC and Fox News sort of hyperventilating about, oh my God, we've got this big realignment. That instead be looked at more lucidly through the lens of history. And what history will tell you is that this wasn't a major wave election. It was a good night for Democrats, but it was a good night for Democrats largely because the Republicans ran a poor campaign, didn't keep their promises, and opposition to that was successful in this midterm, as it has been in many previous midterms. That does not mean that you have won a mandate to govern the party with leftist ideas. And I think misunderstanding those results is dangerous for either party.
So what do Republicans take into 2020 then? Are they, what type of message do they need to shape? You taught the class at USC and gave the talk on what the future of the Republican Party should be. What is that future? Because right now, kind of what we said before, there's like this middle group, and it seems like no one's totally grafting on to what's right. If the country just a few years ago wanted Obamacare repealed and replaced, and now they're voting for more leftist people who are going to put in alternatives that are, people on the right would say, worse than Obamacare, then it seems like no one really has this ideological adherency right now. They're just voting for whatever they think is best. So how do Republicans become the party that is best for the American people?
In a word, I would apply the word to either party, but in a word, I would say ascendancy. I think that most Americans today are less about whether they're conservative or liberal, less about whether they're Republican or Democrat. And by the way, that's an arguable proposition, right? I mean, there's all kinds of research that says I'm not so proud to be a Republican, but I hate Democrats, or the Democrats aren't so proud to be Democrats, but they hate Republicans, right? There was, I'm sure you saw the survey recently that said that that parents now oppose their son or their daughter marrying someone from the opposing party, right? So I don't mean to suggest that partisan divisions are not significant and real and need to be dealt with. What I am suggesting is that for most voters, we're not even sure what liberal and conservative means anymore. We've been disappointed by our own and by the opposition, and we've been disappointed by them for an extended period of time. Remember the sort of the 12-year pattern that we talked about earlier in our conversation, that we've gone from Democrat to Republican to Democrat to Republican, and we've done so very quickly, very rapidly over half a dozen American elections now, consecutive American elections. What does that tell you? I think it tells you that neither party is articulating a vision about how I make your life better, right? If you are an average American voter, it may be true that the economy is in good shape. It may be true that the party that I prefer has won. But what is also true is that things in my life are not getting as they don't feel as good as the technical indicators might suggest. So it may be true that inflation is low and has been low for a long time, but go compare what my grocery bill looked like 5 years ago to what it looks like today, right? Gas prices have declined for a long time. They were very much on the rise when that was a big problem for a lot of middle American voters, energy prices more broadly. Go look at Obamacare, for example. I don't think there's any doubt that Obamacare has failed to deal with the high prices that families and individuals are paying. Now, are there some advantages to it? Are there some things that we should consider keeping? There probably are. Nevertheless, to declare victory as a Democrat on Obamacare and say that we've dealt with healthcare prices just doesn't ring true to people. I think one of the other great issues for middle American voters is I can work hard and play by the rules, and maybe he's doing better, and I'm not worried about losing my job, but I'm sure as hell worried about whether my son or daughter can afford a college education, right, without having a mortgage-sized pile of student debt. And by the way, over the last 3 decades, the cost of a bachelor's degree has consistently increased greater than the rate of inflation, yet the value of that bachelor's degree once I'm out in a career-oriented job has consistently declined, right? And so there are those kinds of issues in the country that neither Republicans nor Democrats are dealing with, that neither conservatism nor liberalism, when those ideologies are confined simply to opposing the other, they don't deal with those real issues in people's lives. So how does the Republican Party get back ahead of that? I think the Republican Party needs to become, number one, the ideas party again, which it exclusively can be. And number two, it needs to be the party that articulates fearlessly and consistently how those ideas get every American to a better future. I think if you capture the fundamental American value of ascendancy, that there's still great political power in that. And my argument to you is that cycles where we have failed to do that, we've been losing elections. And that would include this most recent cycle where we told the country we were going to deal with repeal and replace. We were given what we asked for over an extended period of time, the House, the Senate, the White House, and we did not repeal and replace. We did not reduce your health care costs. We did not deal with the cost of education. We did not deal with the cost of prescription drugs. We did not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. I think you got to deal with those things. You got to deal with those things in a positive, inclusive, open way that says to the country, we're not afraid of arguing over ideas because our ideas, in fact, do work better in the lives of real people. We both parties have been out of the practice of doing that. And I think I wouldn't simply say that to my Republican Party. I would say that to the Democratic Party as well. I think that the party in American politics that captures the attribute, if you will, of ascendancy is going to be a majority party for a long time to come. I would also say that I don't see either party recapturing that mantle in the near future.
So what are some of those ideas then that Republicans should be talking about? Are they being talked about right now? Or, I mean, do you feel that are those just conservative ideas?
At a white paper level, are they being talked about right now? Sure. Look at the work that organizations like AEI, for example, and others are doing and have been doing. the idea that centralized federal government is not only not the only place, but in many cases not the best place to solve big problems in the country, I think is one that has a lot of salience. And it has a lot of salience in a time when the culture at large is moving away from acceptance of conformity demanding, conformity producing things in our lives. And I don't just mean in politics. I mean as consumers, as workers, as families. That our culture has increasingly become about governing ourselves, making decisions ourselves, self-empowerment. Those are limited government conservative ideas. Those are not big centralized federalist ideas. And so I think if the Republican Party, if limited government conservatives would run more confidently on those kinds of things and probably culturally freshen up the way that we talk about them, but to talk about them in an ascendant and culturally relevant way, I think that's a majority party in this country still today, and maybe even increasingly.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because you have kind of the end goals for both parties, I feel, are the same. So you look on the Democrats' website, the Better Deal, I think is what it's called, and they have lower prescription drugs, more affordable health care. I mean, both parties have the same end goal. It's just the way of getting there. So I think...
and I would say that neither party has been held particularly accountable for how are you going to achieve those claims. Mm-hmm. And I think, I understand that the Democrats can't achieve those claims. More big making lives achieve those things. We'll never achieve those things. It never has historically. Republicans, on the other hand, don't have to be afraid of that conversation. That opening up things to the marketplace has always been an effective and productive and sustainable model for innovation and growth and inclusion in that prosperity, frankly, despite what our Democratic friends say about us pejoratively. And so I think driving questions about it's great, Mr. Democrat, that you want to reduce healthcare costs. How exactly are you going to do that? You're going to do that by bringing more into D.C., by allowing more of our healthcare decisions to be made by bureaucrats in Washington rather than between you and your doctor? That's going to do nothing to reduce healthcare costs, right? So how are we going to open that system up to innovation? How are we going to open that system up to new cures, to new forms of treatment? How are we going to deal with those big issues? You're not going to deal with them with a bunch of bureaucrats behind their desks in buildings in Washington, D.C. You're going to deal with that out in the country. And that is a set of circumstances that Republicans are far more comfortable with at a policy level than Democrats are. We ought to own that in a constructive and positive way. And we haven't. And frankly, we're just as guilty as the Democrats are on some of those things, right? We ran on repeal and replace, yet most Americans cannot articulate what a Republican replacement plan would look like. Some would say that's because there isn't a Republican replacement plan. I would say, and politically the consequences of what I'm about to say are the same as not having one at all. But I would suggest to you that the problem, in fact, is that there's too much policy and not enough unity within the ranks congressionally in order to get it done. Nevertheless, as a political matter, we as a party were unable to articulate a clear and compelling, concise plan to the American people about what we were going to replace Obamacare with that achieved what the country wanted achieved, which is I want to retain the ability to make my own healthcare decisions, but I want the cost to go down. Right? Democrats will say the cost is going to go down, but the price that they're going to ask you to pay is that you're not going to make as many of your own healthcare decisions. And ultimately, by the way, the price doesn't go down, as we've seen so far with Obamacare. Republicans could be articulating a more compelling a message on that than simply repeal and replace. You got to say, how are you going to repeal and replace? How are you going to replace in a way that I care about? I don't just want cost out of the system. I want costs wrung out for me and my family, for my neighbors, for my community, for my coworkers. If I'm a typical middle American swing voter looking at who I may want to serve as president in 2020.
And now they have the opportunity, Congress is going to have the opportunity to create an alternative, and Republicans have lost their majority in the House. So it's maybe not going to be what they had hoped initially. But I'd like to kind of
And that's why I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just last thought on that. That is very much why I said earlier that Democrats will have the first opportunity, not the only opportunity, but they'll have the first opportunity to establish themselves as policy-minded, as forward-thinking, as looking to do something good for the country that's not merely about opposition. So they will have the first opportunity for sure.
Yeah, and they won't be able to go as far as they want, I wouldn't think, because they don't control the entire government. But even Republicans couldn't really get the votes to do what they wanted and actually end up repealing Obamacare. But kind of, we talk about the future of the Republican Party, and you can't really talk about that without talking about younger voters. You taught the class at USC. You talked earlier in the conversation about how the millennial gap has opened up again, and now we have Generation Z, who's like my generation, becoming the first or voting for the first time. How do Republicans not only formulate those ideas, but then market them to younger voters on places like the college campus that have traditionally become breeding grounds for liberal thought?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think this is one of the great questions facing the modern Republican Party, and more broadly than that, the modern conservative movement. And when I say that, I mean limited government conservatism. So I think a variety of things. One, I'm talking on the mid or long-term horizon, and not on the short-term horizon. I actually am quite optimistic about the potential to have a millennial generation and subsequent generations that are very much aligned, and I mean at a cultural, day-to-day experience of the world level, not a theoretical political level or ideological level, with this idea that you can run your life better than the federal government can run it for you. That fundamentally is the proposition limited government conservatism offers. And when we look at what defines culturally the millennial generation, we talked about a few of these things a minute ago, they are defined by self-governance. If you say to a millennial, I'm going to give you a tool, I'm going to give you an experience, I'm going to give you a way to open up your life to make more decisions about what you want, where you want to go, who you want to be, and so on and so forth. Those are things that those are products, those are services, those are offerings, those are ideas that do very well, and not just politically, but commercially and economically, socially do well. The idea that I'm going to say to you, well, here's a product or a service or an offering or an idea that requires you to accept some authority in your life, that requires that demands of you conformity, or even that is likely to produce conformity, where we have taken choice out of your life. Those things do not do well economically, socially, culturally with millennials. Now, I would say that, and shame on my party for this, by the way, Republicans have not done a particularly good job in the last number of years of articulating that to millennials, or at least articulating that to millennials in the language of this new generation. By the way, that is a political pattern that has repeated itself in American history several times. You think about probably most recently the Reagan Revolution, which was today we think of it in historical terms, but at the time was culturally revolutionary as well as politically revolutionary. You think about the New Democratic Party, the New Democratic movement that predated and then was embraced by Bill Clinton, which ushered in a whole series of national electoral wins for the Democrats. That what those two things share in common was not that they abandoned their ideological beliefs or principles, but rather that they were able to make them culturally relevant again. They were able to modernize and update them for a new time in American culture and in American politics. And I think that's what's required for conservatism today. Nevertheless, I think it is achievable because of the behaviors, the attitudes that define millennial culture today. I think they are fundamentally incompatible with a party and an ideology that believes that Washington can run your life better than you can run it yourself.
And one of the other interesting things that you talked about earlier and that I see all the time on the college campus is the prevalence of identity politics. And it's not just in college campuses, but I mean, at the national level, you hear talk of intersectionality and how our identity groups define us and our characteristics. How can Republicans really reject that notion, which you said was divisive, and still capitalize on minority voters and still on younger voters who seem to really be adhering to this? I mean, if you're in the college classroom, it's just normalized. There's no distinction between here's life without identity politics and here's life with identity politics. Just this is life. Your race is first and foremost the most important thing, and then your gender, sexual orientation, and all the other categories that they have.
It was, I will say, I had a wonderful experience on campus at USC for the semester. Exclusively positive interactions with students. Enormously impressed with the university, with the students, and beyond. One of my great disappointments, I will say, about the interaction on campus is just how ingrained this idea of intersectionality has become. And I, I'll maybe sound a little bit. Let me argue both sides for a minute. Look, as a Republican operative looking at how to win elections in the short term, I think it would be terrific if the Democratic Party nominated somebody whose fundamental claim to the American people is that you, middle American voter, you are the problem with our country based on your race, your gender, your creed, your whatever. To divide the country. I think that is a recipe for disaster. I think that helps Republicans win a lot of elections. I think the country has been convinced rightly over the last decades or centuries that race and gender and orientation are not qualifiers and they are not disqualifiers. They are not what define us, then they shouldn't be what define our politics. I think to the extent that the Democratic Party is offering that as its principal offering, I think they're going to lose a hell of a lot of elections. As a Republican, I'm rooting for them to lose a hell of a lot of elections. So I guess in the short term, that would be okay. That said, before I'm a Republican, I'm a patriot. And I don't think it's very good for the country to limit the debate that way. I think when real, serious, thoughtful debates about how we get the whole country to a better place revolve around public policy ideas around how best to answer questions like controlling the cost of healthcare and creating good paying jobs and making sure we're energy independent and securing the country for the next generation. I think those are important debates that have nothing to do with the color of your skin or the gender that you, or any of those other kinds of considerations. And so I think sort of maybe back to a more practical question about how Republicans deal with it. I think that there's a fundamental flaw in the argument that I have to talk to different groups differently. I think that what we share in common as Americans is a hope for a better future, right? And not only a hope, a demand for a better future. And it fundamentally is what has defined us for a couple of hundred years now, and I think defines us still. And I think it transcends race and gender and orientation and age differences and others. Is that fundamentally what I expect as an American is that if you work hard and you play by the rules, tomorrow's going to be better than yesterday, that my kids are going to have it better than I did, that more and more opportunities are going to open up. Possibilities that we probably haven't even imagined yet should be ours almost as a birthright. And I think that when the two parties are arguing in the best sense about how to maximize that, how to capture that, how to accelerate that for every American, I think that is a much more compelling and much more embraceable form of politics that frankly has nothing to do with the silliness about intersectionality that's going on campuses right now.
And it's something that I think is hard to not think about and not be caught up in, even when you don't agree with it and you don't believe it's the way that the world should work or that you should see the world. It's just the first thing you think about when you're told constantly that those are the groups that matters or what group someone is. And it's almost, I would say, perpetuating racism and sexism and all the things they're trying to get rid of. Because, I mean, there was a study, I was trying to look for it, it's from one of the Ivy Leagues, and essentially what it found was that white progressive candidates use different language when talking to minorities and different minority groups than Republicans did, conservative candidates did, the conservatives just had kind of generic language that they used for everyone, whereas progressives had very tailored language to each group. So it's something that, I think is very damaging to the country on that level. And I think Republicans on the national stage aren't really zoning in on as much. I don't know. I think it's just kind of being bred on the college campus, and that's a ground that I would think is important for Republicans to really get involved in.
Look, long-term strategically it is. Short-term, either party, but in this case, my Republican Party probably gets away with not dealing with it as aggressively as it should in the short term. And why? It goes back to my claim from earlier that the Democrats have a geographical problem, right? If the Democratic nominee for president in 2020 gets more votes on campus at USC than they got for Hillary Clinton last time, is it going to make one shred of difference to the outcome of the presidential? No, it's not. And what I'll tell you is that in places like Ohio and Western Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Florida, the concern is not about intersectionality. The concern is about whether my life's getting better. Mm-hmm. And I don't so much want a politician, if I'm a swing voting middle American voter, I don't so much want a politician that explains to me why things aren't great. I want a politician that I can follow into a better future. And I don't think that I don't think Republicans have to deal with intersectionality in order to win re-election in 2020. But I think in terms of getting ahead of the cultural conversation, I think we need to be much more aggressive about pushing back on this.
Well, wrapping up down to the last few minutes here, do you have any final thoughts for the audience?
Well, I would simply say, as I had a chance to say to the students who took my class this fall, I think that we are in one of the most exciting times in modern American politics that I can think of. That the country is looking for something that it's not getting, and it's not getting it from the Republican Party or the conservative movement. It's not getting it from the Democratic Party or the liberal movement. It is hungry for ascendancy. It's hungry for positive change. It's hungry for something that the old guard in politics has not provided, and frankly, probably won't be providing on the short-term horizon. And I think if you're a young person looking at a career in politics or a career in public policy or both, I think that as tempting as it is to focus on what's wrong with what I've just said, I suggest to young people in politics that really that hunger that I wouldn't accept that the discord and dysfunction in American politics is here to stay. I think instead what it is the sort of the result of an unsatiated appetite for something bigger and better, more durable, more positive, more embraceable by all Americans. And I think that because of where we are sort of in political history, I think there are just a truckload of opportunities for young people in politics to come and do big, bold, positive things politics, both for their own careers and much more importantly for their communities, for their states, for their country, than most young political operatives through most of political history have had a chance to do. The country is looking for something else. If you can be that change in a positive, ascendant, embraceable way, you got a future in politics. And so that was my message to students on campus. It's my message to your listeners as well. I don't think that the mess we're in is the mess that we need to be in, that the country wants something better, and it's on us to find it.
Well, thank you for coming on the show today, Gentry. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
And that is all today for the episode with Gentry Collins, the former political director at the Republican National Committee. If you enjoyed that episode, then you will most certainly enjoy listening to my last interview with Louise Alvarado, who is a Republican political consultant who specializes in helping Latino Republicans getting elected to municipal offices. We discussed many of the same topics from a Hispanic perspective and from a state level perspective in California. So head on over to theedgeofideas.com or iTunes or wherever you get your podcast to listen to that episode. If you'd like to become a supporter of the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/billswithluke and subscribe there. Any support is appreciated. I love our Patreons. And with that, I will be heading back to school soon. I've produced these 2 episodes over winter break, so might be a little spotty on when we have more podcast episodes, but I'm hoping to bring you more from USC's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. I will actually be in a class on podcasting this semester, so lots of exciting potential there for upcoming interviews and episodes. So stay tuned, stick with it. Go to theedgeofvideos.com and subscribe for a notification when the next episode comes out. I cannot wait for you all to be along with me on this journey. With that, I'm Luke Scorzel, and you are listening to Bills.